Antonio Vivaldi. He was born on the 4th of March 1678 and he lived until the 28th of July 1741, and so he died aged 63. Born in Venice, Italy, Antonio Vivaldi is viewed as the master of the Baroque instrumental concerto. Struggles during his lifetime ultimately ended with him dying a pauper in 1741. However, Vivaldi is regarded as one of the greatest Baroque composers, and Vivaldi's influence during his lifetime was widespread across Europe, giving origin to many imitators and admirers. Notably, J.S. Bach was significantly influenced by Vivaldi in his own compositions. Vivaldi pioneered many developments in orchestration, violin technique, and programmatic music, and consolidated the emerging concerto form, especially the solo concerto, into a widely accepted and followed idiom. Why was he called the Red Priest? Well, Vivaldi's crop of curly red hair, inherited from his father, prompted friends to nickname the composer Il Prete Rosso, the Red Priest. The sobriquet has stuck ever since. His father was just nicknamed Rossi, or Redhead. In the picture you see that Vivaldi has white hair, but don't be fooled, the composer was wearing a wig as he was being painted here. Despite the fact that Vivaldi wrote around 800 different works, his music was rarely played from his death in 1741, when his manuscripts were locked away, or even attributed to other composers, because he was deemed to be out of favour. The resurgence of Vivaldi came in the 20th century, in fact. Alongside his religious duties, the composer spent 37 years of his life as a composer, teacher and conductor at the Pio Ospedale della Pietà, asylum for orphaned girls in Venice. The original building is now a hotel restaurant, but the nearby church was completed in 1761, 20 years after Vivaldi's death, in fact. So Vivaldi taught at an orphanage for girls and wrote a lot of music for the girls to play. People came from miles around to hear Vivaldi's talented students perform the beautiful music he had written. Okay, let's go through a timeline of the great composer's life. On the 4th of March 1678, the composer Antonio Vivaldi is born in Venice. In 1693, he begins to study to become a priest, and then is ordained as a priest in 1703. In 1709, Vivaldi begins to work as a violin teacher in the Venetian orphanage for girls. And in 1711, he publishes his 12 concertos, L'Estro Armonico. In 1713, his first opera is performed. In 1716, he publishes his 12 concertos, collectively titled La Stravaganza, and his Cantata Giuditta Triumphant is published. And between 1718 to 1720, Vivaldi works at the ducal court in Mantua. In 1725, there are rumours of a liaison with the singer Anna Giraud. Around 1725, Antonio Vivaldi's most famous work, Le Quattro Stagioni, The Four Seasons, is first published. In 1729, Vivaldi composes 12 concertos for flute. In 1735, he is appointed the musical director of the Conservatorio Pio Ospedale della Pietà in Venice. And in 1737, he is formally censored by the church for conduct unbecoming of a priest. Then in 1739, Vivaldi is invited to compose music for the Grand Festival in Venice, and in fact, on the 28th of July 1741, Antonio Vivaldi dies of unknown causes in Vienna. Let's begin by giving a bit of context and talking about Venice itself. Vivaldi, of course, was born in Venice. Venice is situated on 120 islands formed by 177 canals in the lagoon between the mouths of the Po and Piave rivers at the northern extremity of the Adriatic Sea. Venice became known as the Queen of the Adriatic, reflecting its historic role as a naval power and commercial centre. The Crusades and the resulting development of trade with Asia and the Middle East led to the establishment of Venice as the greatest commercial centre for trade with the East and politically the strongest European power in the Mediterranean region. Governed effectively by its wealthy merchants with a focus on trade, Venice prospered. The great houses, palaces, public buildings and so forth that we enjoy today are the legacy of aristocratic wealth. Venice established its supremacy over the Adriatic, its home waters, and the northern Mediterranean. Further wars of conquest enabled Venice to acquire neighbouring territories, and by the late 15th century, the city-state was the leading maritime power in the Christian world. Travel up and down the Croatian coast to see evidence everywhere of Venetian architecture, statues, and city planning. But by the mid-1600s, Venice was losing its commercial power as new trading routes opened and new power structures developed in the Mediterranean. So Venice, undeterred, opened itself up to the newly travelling aristocracy as a tourist centre, with its masked carnivals and splendiferous canal processions set against the backdrop of its unique location and architecture. In 1668, an Italian voyage by Richard Lascelles was published, and the institution of the Grand Tour of Europe was born. The Grand Tourist was typically a young man with a thorough grounding in Greek and Latin literature, as well as leisure time, financial means and some interest in art. London was a frequent starting point for Grand Tourists, and Paris a compulsory destination. Many travelled to the Netherlands, some to Switzerland and Germany, and a very few adventurers to Spain, Greece or Turkey. The essential place to visit, however, was Italy. Domestic music making among the wealthier families was a popular and highly prized art, and for many grand tourists the celebrated virtuosi, the concerts and the compositions of Baroque masters, especially in Italy, would have been a major focus of their travels. They would also bring back music scores or handwritten copies of the latest Italian compositions. Within Italy, the great focus was Rome, but Venice was also recognised as a great music centre, both for its concerts and its operatic traditions. The violin was especially prized among Venetian composers, perhaps due to the proximity of eminent violin makers and families such as Amati and Stradivarius, but of course Venice itself had its own very fine violin makers. The reputation of Baroque Venice as a musical centre was one of the highest in Europe, due largely to its 4 conservatories of music. Beginning as charitable foundations, they developed gradually as seats of musical learning, and by the early 1700s their excellence was unrivaled. There were 4 of them, all for illegitimate or orphan girls whose parents could not support them. These were brought up at the state's expense and trained exclusively in music. Apparently, these fine musicians sang like angels, played the violin, flute, organ, oboe, cello, bassoon. The performances were entirely their own, and each concert was composed of about 40 girls. This is the incredible Venice that Vivaldi was born in. So now let's come on to the biography of Antonio Vivaldi. His full name was Antonio Lucio Vivaldi. His parents were Camilla Gallicchio and Giovanni Battista Vivaldi, and he had 5 siblings. Vivaldi's father, Giovanni Battista, was also a professional violinist. Antonio Vivaldi was the eldest of 9 children and entered the priesthood likely because this was the way that a poor family could obtain free schooling at the time. He was baptized immediately after his birth at home by the midwife. The reason for which has led to speculation, but most likely it was done due to his poor health, which we'll talk about further on in the video. Perhaps they feared that he wouldn't live long, and so they baptized him in haste. The rumour that an earthquake struck on the day that he was born apparently is false, it would seem. The earthquake that struck Venice was on the 17th of April 1688. Vivaldi, however, was born in 1678, so I guess he would have been 10 years old when that earthquake hit. The names of Vivaldi's 5 known siblings are documented: Bonaventura Tommaso, Margherita, Gabriella, Cecilia Maria, Francesco, Gaetano, Zanetta, Anna. Vivaldi's health was problematic. One of his symptoms, strettezza di petto, or tightness of the chest, has been interpreted as a form of bronchial asthma. This severe asthma inhibited his speech and even made him weak and dizzy when he spoke. Other possible explanations of his condition are angina pectoris or a nervous disorder, but I think the consensus is that he had a severe form of asthma. The illness did not, however, prevent him from learning to play the violin, composing, or taking part in musical activities, although it did prevent him from playing wind instruments. Another possibility put forward was that Vivaldi was simulating illness to excuse himself from his priestly duties. There is a story that he sometimes left the altar in order to quickly jot down a musical idea in the sacristy. Obviously, he was distracted from the priesthood by music. However, it is fairly widely documented that Antonio Vivaldi suffered from a genuine lifelong illness. Most likely it was severe asthma, so it seems reasonable to accept that as a fact. In any event, he had become a priest against his own will. Vivaldi, however, was destined not for the priesthood, but for a life of music. His father, Giovanni Battista, was a barber and also a baker, before becoming a professional violinist and one of the founders of the Sovegno dei Musicisti di Santa Cecilia, an association of musicians. It would appear that Vivaldi's father was probably his main teacher. He made his first known public appearance playing alongside his father in the Basilica as a supernumerary violinist, in other words, in excess of the normal or requisite number of violinists, in 1696. He went on to become an excellent violinist. After his father taught Antonio to play the violin, they toured Venice, father playing the violin with his young son. Antonio was probably taught at an early age, judging by the extensive musical knowledge he had acquired by age 24, when he started working at the Ospedale della Pietà, the devout hospital of mercy, one of the orphanages in Venice. The president of the Sovegno di Santa Cecilia and maestro di cappella at St. Mark's Basilica was Giovanni Legrenzi, an early Baroque composer. It's possible that Legrenzi gave the young Antonio his first lessons in composition. Vivaldi's father may in fact have been himself a composer. In 1689, an opera titled La Fedeltà Sfortunata was composed by a Giovanni Battista Rossi, the name under which Vivaldi's father had joined the Sovegno di Santa Cecilia. In 1693, at the age of 15, he began studying to become a priest, and was ordained in 1703 aged 25, and soon nicknamed Il Prete Rosso, the Red Priest. As mentioned, this would have referred to the colour of his hair, a family trait. Within a year of being ordained, he ceased saying Mass, blaming a physical ailment. Though he likely simply preferred to immerse himself in music, he would reportedly hurry from the altar to write a musical idea. He remained known for much of his career as the red-haired priest. Despite his bad asthma keeping Antonio from saying Mass, he took his status as a secular priest seriously and even earned the reputation of a religious bigot. Beginning in 1703, and for most of his life, Vivaldi was employed by the Ospedale della Pietà, one of 4 musical conservatories in Venice. There were 4 very similar institutions, and their purpose was to give shelter and education to children who were abandoned or orphaned, or whose families could not support them. The Pietà specialised in the musical training of its female wards, and those with musical aptitude were assigned to its excellent choir and orchestra, whose much praised performances assisted the institution's quest for donations and legacies. Vivaldi had dealings with the Pietà for most of his career under 3 main guises: as violin master between 1703 to 1709 and between 1711 to 1715, as director of instrumental music between 1716 and 17 and 1735 to 38, and as paid external supplier of compositions between 1723 to 29 and 1739 to 40. Over the next 30 years, he composed most of his major works while working at the Ospedale. The Ospedale were financed by funds provided by the Republic. The boys learned a trade and had to leave when they reached the age of 15. The girls, however, received a musical education. The most talented among them stayed and became members of the Ospedale's renowned orchestra and choir. Shortly after Vivaldi's appointment, the orphans began to gain appreciation and esteem abroad too. Vivaldi wrote concertos, cantatas and sacred vocal music, especially for them. Not just a virtuoso player and a virtuoso composer, Vivaldi was also a virtuoso teacher, as clearly evidenced by the level of competence attained by his pupils. In 1704, the position of teacher of viola all'inglese was added to his duties as violin instructor. The position of maestro di coro, which at one time was filled by Vivaldi, required a lot of time and work. He had to compose an oratorio or concerto for every feast and teach the orphans both music theory and how to play certain instruments. His relationship with the board of directors of the Ospedale was at times strained. The board had to vote every year on whether to keep a teacher. The vote on Vivaldi was seldom unanimous and went 7-6 against him in 1709. But in 1711, after a year as a freelance musician, he was recalled by the Ospedale with a unanimous vote. Clearly, during his year's absence, the board had realised the importance of his role. He became responsible for all of the musical activity of the institution when he was promoted to Maestro de Concerti, music director, in 1716, and was then responsible for composing 2 new concertos every month. Perhaps this explains the prolific output by Vivaldi. In 1705, the first collection of his works was published by Giuseppe Sala. His Opus 1 is a collection of 12 sonatas for 2 violins and basso continuo. That came about in 1705. In 1709, a second collection of 12 sonatas for violin and basso continuo appeared, his Opus 2. Then came his real breakthrough as a composer, with his first collection of 12 concerti for 1, 2 and 4 violins with strings, L'Estro Armonico, or Opus 3. Which was in fact published in Amsterdam by Estienne Roger and dedicated to Grand Prince Ferdinand of Tuscany, a prince who sponsored many musicians including Scarlatti, and Handel was a musician himself and hence a keen patron of the arts. Vivaldi probably met him in Venice. L'Estro Armonico was a resounding success all over Europe. It was followed in 1714 by La Stravaganza, Opus 4, collection of concerti for solo violin and strings, dedicated to an old violin student of Vivaldi's, the Venetian noble Vertodolfin. Vivaldi travelled extensively and throughout his career had his choice of commissions from nobility and the highest members of society, and so the ability to use the best performers and the business savvy to control publication of his works. In February 1711, Vivaldi and his father together travelled to Brescia, where his setting of the Stabat Mater RV621 was played as part of a religious festival. The work seems to have been written in haste. The string parts are simple, the music of the first three movements is repeated in the next three, and not all of the text is set. Nevertheless, perhaps in part because of the forced essentiality of the music, the work is considered to be one of his early masterpieces. Despite his frequent travels from 1718, still the Ospedale paid him 2 sequins to write 2 concerti a month for the orchestra and to rehearse with them at least 5 times when he was in Venice. The orphanage's records show that he was paid for 140 concerti between 1723 and 1733. In early 18th century Venice, opera was the most popular musical entertainment and proved most profitable for Vivaldi. In 1714, Vivaldi became the impresario of the Teatro San Angelo in Venice, composing Ottone in Villa, Orlando Finto Pazzo, Nerone Fatto Cesare, which is now lost. In the late season, Vivaldi planned to put on an opera entirely of his own creation, Arsilda Regina di Ponto, but the state censor blocked the performance. The main character, Arsilda, falls in love with another woman, Lycea, who's pretending to be a man. Vivaldi got the censor to accept the opera the following year, and it was a resounding success. In 1716, Vivaldi wrote and produced 2 more operas, L'Incoronazione di Dario and La Costanza Trionfanti degli Amori e degli Odi. The latter was so popular that it was performed 2 years later, re-edited and retitled Artabano Re dei Parti, but has now been lost. This opera was also performed in Prague in 1732. In the years that followed, Vivaldi wrote several operas that were performed all over Italy. In a letter written by Vivaldi to his patron Marchese Bentivoglio in 1737, he makes reference to his 94 operas. Only about 50 of Vivaldi's operas have in fact been discovered, and no other documentation of the remaining operas exists. In 1717 or 1718, Vivaldi was offered a prestigious new position as Maestro di Cappella of the court of Prince Philip of Hesse-Darmstadt, governor of Mantua in the northwest of Italy. From 1718 to 1720, he worked in Mantua as a director of secular music for that city's governor, Prince Philip of Hesse-Darmstadt. This was the only full-time post Vivaldi ever held. He seems to have preferred life as a freelance composer for the flexibility and entrepreneurial opportunities it offered him. Vivaldi's major compositions in Mantua were operas, though he also composed cantatas and instrumental works. The 1720s were the zenith of Vivaldi's career. Based once more in Venice, but frequently travelling elsewhere, he supplied instrumental music to patrons and customers throughout Europe. During the early 1720s, Vivaldi was also active in Rome, where he found a patron in the person of Cardinal Pietro Ottoboni, a great music lover, who earlier had been the patron of Arcangelo Corelli. And if we can believe Vivaldi himself, the Pope asked him to come and play the violin for him at a private audience. Vivaldi also wrote works on commission from foreign rulers, such as the French King, Louis XV, the Serenade, La Cena Festeggiante, Festival on the Seine, for example. Earlier in the 1660s, musical life in Rome had been enormously stimulated by the presence in the city of Christina of Sweden. The Palace of the North, as she was called, abdicated from the Swedish throne in 1654, and a few years later moved to Rome and took up residence in the Palazzo Riario. There she organised musical events that were attended by composers such as Corelli and Scarlatti. And so Vivaldi profited from the favourable cultural climate in the city with its wealthy patrons. After Vivaldi's time in Mantua, he was in Milan around 1721, where he presented the pastoral drama La Silvia. 9 arias from it survive. He visited Milan again the following year with the oratorio L'Adorazione degli Tre Re Magi al Bambino Gesù, which is now lost. And in 1722 was when he moved to Rome. The Pope who Vivaldi played for was apparently Pope Benedict XIII. Then in 1725 Vivaldi returned to Venice, where he produced 4 operas in the same year. Despite his stay in Rome and other cities, Vivaldi remained in the service of the Ospedale della Pietà, which nominated him Maestro di Concerti. And it was during this period that Vivaldi wrote the 4 Seasons, 4 violin concertos that give musical expression to the seasons of the year. Notorious for his vanity and the most prolific of European composers, Vivaldi boasted that he could compose a concerto faster than it could be copied. Praised more by contemporaries as a violinist than a composer, Vivaldi composed operas, hundreds of concertos, and lesser-known stage and choral music. During his time in Mantua, Vivaldi became acquainted with an aspiring young singer, Anna Tessieri Giro, who would become his student protégé and favourite prima donna. Anna, along with her older half-sister Paolina, moved in with Vivaldi and regularly accompanied him on his many travels. In 1726, the contralto Anna Giro sang for the first time in a Vivaldi opera. Born in Mantua around 1711, she'd gone to Venice to further her career as a singer. Her voice was not strong, but she was attractive and acted well. She became part of Vivaldi's entourage and the indispensable prima donna of his subsequent operas, causing gossip to circulate that she was Vivaldi's mistress. After Vivaldi's death, she continued to perform successfully in opera until quitting the stage in 1748 to marry a nobleman. There was speculation as to the nature of Vivaldi and Giro's relationship, but no evidence exists to indicate anything beyond friendship and professional collaboration. Vivaldi, in fact, adamantly denied any romantic relationship with Giro in a letter to his patron Bentivoglio, dated 16th of November 1737. Vivaldi maintained that she was no more than a housekeeper and good friend, just like Anna's sister Paolina, who also shared his house. Vivaldi collaborated with choreographer Giovanni Gallo on several of his later operas staged in Venice, with Gallo choreographing the ballets found within those works. At the height of his career, he received commissions from European nobility and royalty, some of which were Louis XV, Emperor Charles VI, and others. In 1725 came the publication of Il cimento dell'armonia e dell'invenzione, the Trial of Harmony and Invention, Opus 8, which appeared in Amsterdam. It consisted of 12 concertos, 7 of which were descriptive: The 4 Seasons, Storm at Sea, Pleasure, and The Hunt. Vivaldi transformed the tradition of descriptive music into a typically Italian musical style, with its unmistakable timbre in which the strings play a major role. These concertos were enormously successful, particularly in France. Spring was also a firm favourite of King Louis XV, who would order it to be performed at the most unexpected moments. And Vivaldi received various commissions for further compositions from the court at Versailles. In 1730, together with his father, Antonio Vivaldi and Anna Giro travelled to Prague. In this music-loving city, half a century later, Mozart would also celebrate his first operatic triumphs there. Vivaldi met a Venetian opera company which between 1724 and 1734 staged some 60 operas in the theatre of Count Franz Anton von Spock, for whom incidentally Bach produced his 4 shorter masses. In the 1730-31 season, 2 new operas by Vivaldi were premiered there, after the previous season had closed with his opera Farnace, a work the composer often used as his showpiece. In 1732, Vivaldi spent time in Mantua and Verona, and in 1738 Vivaldi was in Amsterdam, where he conducted a festive opening concert for the 100th anniversary of the Schouwburg Theatre. Later years and death. Like many composers of the time, Vivaldi faced financial difficulties in his later years. His compositions were no longer held in such high esteem as they had once been in Venice, changing musical tastes, making them outmoded. Late in life, he was plagued by rumours of a sexual liaison with a vocal student, was censored by ecclesiastical authorities, and then went off to Vienna. Vivaldi chose to sell off sizable numbers of his manuscripts at paltry prices to finance his migration to Vienna, after meeting the Emperor Charles VI. During Carnival in Venice was when Vivaldi took the decision to move to Vienna, hoping for royal support, as he wished to take up the position of a composer in the imperial court. In the 1730s, Vivaldi's career had been gradually declining. The French traveller Charles de Brosse reported in 1739 with regret that his music was no longer fashionable. Vivaldi's impresarial forays became increasingly marked by failure. However, this was not to be, because the music-loving emperor died soon after Vivaldi's arrival, which left the composer without any imperial patronage or a steady source of income, and plunged him straight into abject poverty. And so, tragically, the great composer became impoverished and died in poverty less than a year later. It is said that he died of internal infection or internal fire in a house owned by the widow of a Viennese saddle maker. See my video on this topic of the tragic ends of Vivaldi and Paganini. Dying a pauper in 1741, he did not live to attend the production of his opera L'Oracolo in Messenia in 1742 in Vienna. The simplicity of Vivaldi's funeral on July 28, 1741 further suggests that he died in considerable poverty. Vivaldi was buried in a simple grave in a burial ground that was owned by the public hospital fund, the Burgerspital Gottesacker Cemetery, next to St. Charles's Church, a Baroque church in an area that is now part of the site of the TU Wien University. The cemetery existed until 1807. The house where he lived in Vienna has since been destroyed. The Hotel Sacher is built on part of the site. Memorial plaques have been placed at both locations, as well as a Vivaldi star in the Viennese Musikmeile and a monument at the Rooseveltplatz. Only 2 and possibly 3 original portraits of Vivaldi are known to survive: an engraving, an ink sketch and an oil painting. The engraving, which was the basis of several copies produced later by other artists, was made in 1725 by François Morellon de la Cave for the first edition of Il Cemento dell'Armonia e dell'Invenzione, and shows Vivaldi holding a sheet of music. The ink sketch, a caricature, was done by Ghezzi in 1723 and shows Vivaldi's head and shoulders in profile. It exists in 2 versions, a first jotting kept at the Vatican Library and a much lesser known, slightly more detailed copy recently discovered in Moscow. The oil painting, which can be seen in the International Museum and Library of Music of Bologna, is by an anonymous artist and is thought to depict Vivaldi due to its strong resemblance to the La Cave engraving. Vivaldi composed many instrumental concertos for the violin and a variety of other musical instruments, as well as sacred choral works and more than 50 operas. Many of his compositions were written for the all-female music ensemble of the Ospedale della Pietà, a home for abandoned children in his native Venice. Vivaldi's earliest musical compositions date from his first years at the Pietà. Printed collections of his trio sonatas and violin sonatas respectively appeared in 1705 and 1709, and in 1711 his first and most influential set of concerti for violin and string orchestra, Opus 3, was published by the Amsterdam music publishing firm of Estienne Roger. In the years up to 1719, Roger published 3 more collections of his concerti, Opuses 4, 6 and 7, and 1 collection of sonatas, Opus 5. Vivaldi's debut as a composer of sacred vocal music was in 1713. When the Pieter's choirmaster left his post and the institution had to turn to Vivaldi and other composers for new compositions, he achieved great success with his sacred vocal music, for which he later received commissions from other institutions. And then another field of endeavour for him opened from 1713 with his first opera, Ottone in Villa, produced in Vicenza. Returning to Venice, Vivaldi immediately plunged into operatic activity in the twin roles of composer and impresario. Between 1725 and 1729, he entrusted 5 new collections of concerti opuses 8 to 12 to Roger's publisher successor, Michel Charles Le Sen. After 1729, Vivaldi stopped publishing his works, finding it more profitable to sell them in manuscript to individual purchasers. During this decade, he also received numerous commissions for operas and resumed his activity as an impresario in Venice and other Italian cities. Vivaldi perfected the form of what would become the classical 3-movement concerto. Indeed, he helped establish the fast, slow, fast plan of the concerto's 3 movements. Perhaps more importantly, Vivaldi was the first to employ regularly in his concerti the ritornello form, in which recurrent restatements of a refrain alternate with more episodic passages featuring a solo instrument. Vivaldi's bold juxtapositions of the refrains, ritornelli, and the solo passages opened new possibilities for virtuosic display by solo instrumentalists. The fast movements in his concerti are notable for their rhythmic drive and the boldness of their themes, while the slow movements often present the character of arias written for the solo instrument. More than 50 authentic sacred vocal compositions by Vivaldi are extant. They range from short hymns for solo voices to oratorios and elaborate psalm settings in several movements for double choir and orchestra. Many of them exhibit a spiritual depth and command of counterpoint equal to the best of their time. The mutual independence of voices and instruments often anticipates the later symphonic masses of Joseph Haydn and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. As more of this repertory becomes available in modern editions, its reputation seems likely to rise. His most famous work, The 4 Seasons, was published in 1725 in a set of 12 concertos, each in the distinct form of fast, slow, fast movements. This work especially appealed to the French. It's probably one of his most famous, if not his most famous composition. Although 3 of the concerti are wholly original, the first, Spring, borrows motifs from the A Sinfonia in the first act of Vivaldi's contemporaneous opera Il Giustino. The inspiration for the concertos was probably the countryside around Mantua. They were a revolution in musical conception. In them, Vivaldi represented flowing streams, singing birds of different species, each specifically characterized, barking dogs, buzzing mosquitoes, crying shepherds, storms, drunken dancers, silent nights, hunting parties, from both the hunters and the prey's point of view, frozen landscapes, ice-skating children, and warming winter fires. Each concerto is associated with a sonnet, possibly by Vivaldi, describing the scenes depicted in the music. They were published as the first 4 concertos in a collection of 12, Il Cemento dell'Armonia e dell'Invenzione, Opus 8, published in Amsterdam by Michel Charles Le Sen in 1725. So Vivaldi actually wrote fragments of poetry on the manuscript for his 4 Seasons. No one's sure exactly who wrote them though. They may have been written by Vivaldi himself, who also provided instructions such as the barking dog in spring, languor caused by the heat in summer, and drunkards have fallen asleep in autumn. Almost 500 concerti by Vivaldi survive. More than 300 are concerti for a solo instrument with a string orchestra and continuo. And of these, approximately 230 are written for solo violin, 40 for bassoon, 25 for cello, 15 for oboe, and 10 for flute. There are also concerti for viola d'amore, recorder, mandolin, and other instruments. His remaining concerti are either double concerti, including about 25 written for 2 violins, concerti grossi using 3 or more soloists, concerti ripieni, string concerti without a soloist, or chamber concerti for a group of instruments without orchestra. After almost 2 centuries of decline, Vivaldi's musical reputation underwent a revival in the early 20th century with much scholarly research devoted to his work. Many of Vivaldi's compositions, once thought lost, have been rediscovered, some as recently as 2015. His music remains widely popular in the present day and is regularly played all over the world. Contemporary luthiers or violin makers in Venice. Vivaldi lived mostly in Venice until his final departure for Vienna in 1740. Matteo Goffrile, Master Domenico Montagnana, and talented Francesco Gobetti, along with German immigrants like Martinus Kaiser, Goffrile's father-in-law, and Christoph Koch, were all luthiers on the Venice scene. Pietro Guarneri of Venice, Peter Guarneris of Venice, was in Venice from 1717 until his death in 1762. Vivaldi used and selected high-quality instruments, particularly those from the Ospedale della Pietà in Venice where he worked, with violins by luthiers like Pietro Guarneri and Matteo Goffrile being part of the institution's collection, used by his talented female students, forming a significant part of Vivaldi's musical legacy. Vivaldi and Mozart may have been born some 500 kilometers away from each other, but both composers were buried in the same place in Vienna. No one is exactly sure where. Vivaldi's grave was lost when Vienna's Technical University was built over the graveyard. Many people think that Vivaldi was the best Italian composer of his time. A Venetian all his life, travelling but always returning, Vivaldi epitomizes Italian Baroque music like no other composer. During his lifetime, Vivaldi was popular in many countries throughout Europe, including France. But after his death, his popularity dwindled. At the end of the Baroque period, Vivaldi's published concerti became relatively unknown and were largely ignored. Even his most famous work, The Four Seasons, was unknown in its original edition during the classical and romantic periods. Vivaldi's work was rediscovered in the 20th century, largely due to the efforts of Italian musicologist Dr. Alberto Gentili, who in the 1920s uncovered vast archives of his manuscripts in Turin, followed by composer Alfredo Casella, organising the first Vivaldi Week in 1939, sparking widespread revival, with modern Vivaldi experts like Professor Michael Talbot continuing to authenticate new discoveries. Much of Vivaldi's music that was lost or hidden has been gradually rediscovered. His flute concerto, Il Gran Mogol, was rediscovered in October 2010 in Scotland, and previously undiscovered manuscript of his opera Orlando Furioso was found in July 2012. I wonder what remains yet to be discovered of his works. After Vivaldi's death, his huge collection of musical manuscripts, consisting mainly of autograph scores of his own works, was bound into 27 large volumes. These were acquired first by the Venetian bibliophile Jacopo Soranzo and later by Count Giacomo d'Orazio, Christoph Willibald Gluck's patron. Rediscovered in the 1920s, these manuscripts today form part of the Foa and Giordano collections of the National Library in Turin. When Vivaldi's now famous Gloria was rediscovered, Alfredo Casella loved the composer so much that he organised Vivaldi Week, where the Gloria and L'Olympiade were revived in 1939. Vivaldi's music isn't just a concert hall favourite, it has also been featured in many films, such as Concerto No. 8 from L'Estro Armonica in Indecent Proposal, The Four Seasons in Pretty Women, and Nulla in Mundi Pac Sincera in Shine. Vivaldi left a decisive mark on the form of the concerto and the style of the late Baroque instrumental music. What does Vivaldi's music mean to you? Here is what it means to me. Like the Sunflowers painting by Van Gogh, Vivaldi has been a constant feature in my home ever since I can remember from my earliest years. I recall, in fact, one occasion when I was quite young, on which I was pleasantly awakened in the morning by Vivaldi's music, which my mum was playing downstairs. From that point on, really, I became a fan. I like to compare different versions of the Four Seasons, for example, the recording by Itzhak Perlman and others, and in the Guinness Classical 1000, Rob Cowan singles out for praise Enrico Onofri's recording with Il Giardino Armonico under Giovanni Antonini, describing performances of the Four Seasons as falling roughly into one of two camps: the warm, elegantly tailored modern instrument version and the raw, primary coloured period instrument versions. Of course, this is the recording that projected violinist Nigel Kennedy to fame in the 1980s. I found it amusing but also thought-provoking when people like my dad once described Vivaldi as the rock star of his day, or Nigel Kennedy talks about playing a bit of Viv as he mixes it with Jimi Hendrix. For me, Vivaldi is one of my favourite composers, and his music takes me back in my imagination into the Baroque past, whilst at the same time never feeling outdated, always relevant. There is a certain purity to the music which in my mind means it should remain unadulterated, at least that's how I prefer to listen to it. Though I would veer slightly towards what Rob Cowan terms the warm modern instrument version, with harpsichord of course, but I prefer my Baroque with a little bit of vibrato sprinkled in anyway. A highlight for me was when I saw the Four Seasons performed live by Joshua Bell at the Birmingham Symphony Hall.